so much, everyone, for joining. So excited to be having this discussion about the important topic of social media against the landscape of compliance. So I'm Tanya Yuki. I'm the founder and CEO of Shareably, and we track all brand activity across social media. So I'm excited to be moderating this discussion. So before we dive in, I'm just going to let our panelists briefly introduce themselves, and then we're going to dive straight into the topics. Why don't we start with you, Sandy?
Okay, briefly, just in case anyone wasn't here for the prior panel, I'm Sandy Brown. I'm an assistant director in the Division of Financial Practices, which is within the Bureau of Consumer Protection of the Federal Trade Commission.
I'm Mark Yudkin. I'm the Chief Legal Officer of VaynerX, which is the holding company for digital marketing agency VaynerMedia and publishing groups like Gallery Media.
I'm Becky Griffith. I'm a legal consultant focusing on marketing and advertising law, and formerly an attorney at Unilever.
All right, so I'm going to start with probably the core tension when you start thinking about social media within the framework of compliance. So on the one hand, you've got this mobile social landscape, which is fast, free. Everyone says, be authentic, be spontaneous, be yourself. And then you also have to balance that against the compliance and regulatory frameworks, as well as those within brand guidelines for your business. So I'm going to open up to the panel, perhaps starting with you, Mark, to talk a little bit about how do you balance that creativity within, within these guidelines.
Yeah, sure. So social media itself is everything's in the moment. You have to be current. And we at Vayner take that to like the nth degree, right? We live, Gary's super fast. We live in a culturally relevant marketing age where we think that's the most important thing. But how do I balance that with ensuring that all 800, 900 employees are adhering to the compliance issues and regulatory landscape that I hold them up to? So some of it's real basic. We do training throughout all of our offices every year. We have a 6-part university session that we do in terms of legal, regulatory matters. We also have this intraweb with a resource hub that kind of is like an open book test for my employees that they can go to and use the resources that are available to them. I think that's obvious. I think most agencies probably do that. I think what we do is kind of different is we kind of do a legal onboarding session for each of our individual clients when they come on board. So what's probably relevant to this group is, we have a big financial services client. So when we got them a year or two ago, we really looked at what we wanted to do, how we wanted to provide those services, and we came up with kind of like a matrix of how they can perform these services. And really what it deals with is kind of using our marketing and our media and how we can use the analytical tools that we have and create custom audiences in a way that's compliant with like fair lending regulations. And so we developed a tool with our client to kind of help our team. And we have a saying at Vayner, freedom within a framework. If we want to be fast, that's what we have to do. We have to give everybody the tools and framework in which to perform their services in a very fast but yet compliant manner. So that's kind of the gist of what we do.
Thank you. And Becky, I'll sort of double click into that. What was that like on the client side where you had to sort of walk those two lines, but you're also competing fiercely for consumer attention? You're in a really highly competitive environment. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like on the client side?
Sure. Well, on the client side, we also wanted to move with speed, and of course social media is super important to all of the brands. But we did have these internal trainings as well. We developed tools, guidance documents for our own brand managers, and we did partner with agencies like Vayner to go and conduct joint trainings on how to properly be compliant with all of the regulations.
And before we move on to the next topic, I have to ask, so how do you plan for when the inevitable thing happens and something goes wrong?
That's me. Okay, good.
800 people
800
in their
people.
20s posting on social.
Yeah, so I will say it's not really the 800 people that we're concerned about. It's really third parties that we can't control. I know we're going to talk about influencers later. We actually have a set process in place. What happens if an influencer maybe goes a little rogue? And we kind of preempt that with the idea we have reasonable monitoring to comply with the FTC requirements to ensure that these influencers don't go rogue, and maybe we can head it off at the beginning. So we kind of have processes in place with respect to kind of head it off at the beginning. The one thing I will say is interesting. We did develop a process about a year and a half ago specifically to the president. And what would happen if the president mentioned brands and went off on them, right? That was everybody's worst nightmare. So we kind of try to stay ahead of it. We can never kind of guess what everybody's going to say, but the fact that we did a whole training session with 2 specific industries about one human being's like potentially to go rogue, that's kind of, we set up the processes before, and there's certain steps that our individual agency teams need to take, including escalating it to somebody like me or my AGC or other people like that.
Yeah, and I think that's often the biggest differentiator is you can't always preempt precisely how something will go in an unexpected way, but you can at least have a process that people walk through so you're not paralyzed or you don't actually respond in the moment spontaneously, which is often the worst possible thing. So I guess transitioning then to the topic of influencers, which, just if you look at social media engagement right now, and you compared all of the engagement that happens by every single, yay, round of applause.
Subway system, ladies and gentlemen.
Welcome.
Fashionably
It did
late.
not comply.
Well, then actually, we'll hold on influencers for a second, and given that you've just sat down, why don't we just take a second, Depayan, for you to introduce yourself and your role in your flag.
Sure, thank you so much, and I apologize again for being late over here. I have been working in Eurofly for about 9 years now, which surprises me every time I say that. That's most of my career. And I just came there to kind of start up the social media enterprise, which has now grown into an entire team that spans both corporate social media and also the use of social media by the field. We have about 12,000 agents who sell our products, and they use social media as both a research tool and a prospecting tool and also a recruiting tool. And I oversee the content and strategy for both sides of the house.
And I'll throw one question that we just circulated sort of back to you on that topic is, can you talk a little bit about how you encourage creativity and sort of in the moment social savvy within your role and sort of across your distributed teams?
Sure. I think that this is one of the biggest hurdles that we had when we first started out, was guiding our compliance team through how to think about social media. It was a place where you had to be live and in the moment in order to come across as authentic. The biggest trouble that I think our agents have is coming across as human beings, right? I mean, the financial services industry since 2008 hasn't been a place that people love very much, and we feel that we're a very different company and we really believe in our agents, but there's still public perception. So how do you combat that? You need to really show that our agents who are living and working every day out there in the world are as much a part of the community as their clients. And our mothers, fathers, just people who coach Little League Baseball, just people living lives and who understand the trials and tribulations that everyone has. And in order to do that, you have to be authentic. You have to post things that are relatively live and relatively current. So we work with our compliance teams fairly early to kind of break down content into red light content, which we all agree we will never put out there in the world, ever. Yellow light content, which has to do with either our financial standings or our products or our recruiting, where there does need to be a layer of compliance approval before we put it out there in the world. And then green light content, where if you want to talk about how you spend a nice day in the park, please go ahead and be our guest. We don't need to run it by compliance people. Not only is it not necessary, but it also just slows everything down. And using that basic framework, I think we were able to kind of facilitate agents to be authentic and live in the moment and not feel like they're having to wait for compliance's approval for everything, even if it's just saying that it was a nice day and that they went to the park with their kids.
And by the time they get approval, it's raining and it just sounds really odd.
It's all over.
So moving on to the topic of influencers that we were just touching on, just a quick fun fact. If you were to add up all of the social media engagement across platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and everything that was published by big social publishers like BuzzFeed, Nat Geo, the NBA, as well as all brands, and compared that to the influencer engagement, influencers would be about 3/4 of all that activity. So it's a really fast growing and important space, but still some would say a little bit like a Wild West. So I'm going to throw to you, Sandy, to talk a little bit about what the FTC has been working on here and just to help us navigate some of the guidelines that are out there.
So just broadly speaking first, the FTC's mission is to police for unfair or deceptive practices, which means that we are particularly focused where advertising could be misleading. So in the influencer/endorser context, what that means is we pay attention to whether or not a particular advertising message or a claim about a product, to the extent it's influenced by some material connection, and I'll unpack that jargon in a minute. If it's influenced by a material connection to the company or otherwise, which I'll also explain in a minute, that can be misleading. And here's why. Because it is material to consumers, i.e. consumers find it important to know if a message that they're seeing on social media is influenced by some other connection that that influencer has to the company or some other thing that they can't see that might be affecting the weight that the consumer should give to that message. So what does that mean in practical terms? So the most obvious material connection is obviously being paid to endorse the product. But there are other material connections. You get a freebie to try the product. You get other perks, you get swag, you get like free travel. That's a material connection. You're an employee of the company in a way that's not otherwise knowable to the consumer seeing your message. You have ownership interest in the company that's not knowable to consumers. So these are some ways in which you might have a material connection as an influencer. And what does that mean? The consumer, when they see that message, they need to also see what that material connection is. And in social media, that, I'm sure a lot of you might find, to the extent you're doing this kind of advertising, find it a challenge. You're dealing with limited real estate, for example. So the FTC, I will say, not to toot our own horns, but to make it helpful for you all, we actually have a number of pieces of guidance that, to the extent you're an advertiser who's interested in using influencers to do, promotional work for you, or are otherwise just advertising directly on your own behalf, I would highly suggest taking a look at our materials. It's actually very accessible. We have the endorsement guides. We have these excellent FAQs on what people are asking in terms of how they disclose connections on social media. And we have something called the .com disclosures, which for a document that came out in 2013, I would suggest that it is remarkably durable and timeless. I just happened to be looking through it, just in the last few days I was preparing to come here, and I found all of the guidance particularly helpful. But let me just give you some sort of top-level headlines in terms of how you make effective disclosures on social media. So a few big key things. The language you use on social media, it should be unambiguous. So it should convey to consumers that the message they're seeing is potentially paid for or influenced. So don't use industry jargon, don't use ambiguous terms.
So something like when Kylie Jenner recently did hashtag Adidas ambassador.
Yes, that's a good example. And actually to this point, let me also point out that we did a number of now publicly available warning letters to influencers to help sort of set some guardrails on what's acceptable or what's not. So examples of the kinds of things that we pulled out as potentially problematic. Hashtag thanks, not cutting it. Hashtag collab, not cutting it. Hashtag spawn, S-P-O-N, not sufficient. Consumers don't know what to make of those kinds of hashtags. So another important principle, where do you make the disclosure? You've got, however many characters and, 2 inches of space. So it's important to think about where that disclosure is gonna go. The guidance from the FTC is it's within the advertising message. And to the extent it can't be embedded inside, it should be on the front end. So what do I mean by that? On Instagram, in terms of text, you're gonna see a couple lines. You can't bury the disclosure if you have to hit more. It's gotta be up front. In a YouTube video, if there's quite a bit of content that's gotta be streamed, the disclosure should be at the beginning of the video, not stuck at the end. And even better, it should pop up periodically if it's a long video, or even permanently. The disclosures themselves, the things that we have found to be acceptable are not, dense boilerplate. It's things like sponsored, paid advertising. These are very few characters. So we don't think it's, we're trying to maintain a balance of allowing sort of business and advertisers to get their message out effectively and usefully in a way that consumers can see, but also for consumers to know that the message that they're seeing is potentially been affected by a connection between the endorser.
So on platforms like Facebook and Instagram, where you have the handshake tag where it says, Kylie Jenner with New York Life, for example, if she was, and that connotes it as a paid partnership. Now that's the official unit that comes through on Facebook and Instagram. Does that suffice?
So I'm not going to, as tempting as it is, I totally understand the desire to throw hypotheticals at me. I'm not going to answer those. I can tell you what we have found to be problematic, because from our perspective, we sit in the shoes of consumers. So here's the question to ask yourself. If you were a consumer who knew nothing about this product or any relationship between the person speaking the message and the company, do you have enough information to understand that there's a connection? So the reason why I can't give you oh, that's cool or not, is it's going to be based on the entire context of the particular ad, like what that social media message looks like, what, the placement, how clear it is that it's a disclosure, would a consumer understand it? So there are a lot of factors, and it would be difficult for me to just say, oh, yep, that would be good to go.
Yeah, and the only reason I go there is that is the official paid partnership sponsored tag that Facebook and Instagram sort of has. So we can
right. To the extent, to the extent you see over time that there are methods by which people are making those disclosures, I don't want to say, everyone speeds, so you should all go 85 miles per hour. I can't sort of wholesale endorse that, but you will see, and I see just as a consumer who's on Twitter a lot, it's easy to spot the ones that are kind of abiding, and it's obvious. Hashtag sponsored, all by itself, right next to the ad. That's pretty apparent to me as a consumer. So you can consider yourself in safe territory if you're doing that.
Got it. So I'll throw to you, Becky. What was this like to actually roll this out with the influencers that you were working with at a big CPG company? Can you talk a little bit about how that practically got implemented?
Sure. So over the last couple of years, I oversaw legal marketing at Unilever for some very well-known and beloved brands like Hellmann's and Lipton, Klondike, Popsicle, Good Humor, and all of them are very interested in using social media to connect with their consumers. The way they did this mainly was through partnerships with influencers, and we had to have a very robust internal compliance program to meet these needs. So the way that I like to think about it, and the way I advise my clients now, and as I did at Unilever, is that there are two main pillars to a good compliance program. The first is accuracy, meaning that all claims have to be fully supported. And the second is transparency, and that is what we just discussed, which is ensuring that where there's a material connection between the influencer and the brand, that connection is disclosed properly and in line with the FTC guidance. So first, I'd like to give a few best practices with regard to transparency, which again focuses on really differentiating these incentivized posts versus simply organic content. First, I think that you can start with your relationship with the influencer and contractually require them to disclose in a certain manner. And I think you can be as specific as you'd like to be in this contract, laying out what could be some pre-approved hashtags or some pre-approved plain language, and also go over the guidelines about where they should disclose. And this can be taken directly from the FTC's guidance and also from those letters that were sent out telling you what to be avoided as well. So a great way to do this, you can have a nice addendum to your contract laying out how things should be done. The second best practice I would recommend is to monitor these posts. And I know that this can be sometimes overwhelming, especially if you're doing it manually, which sometimes we needed to do. But you need to actually make sure that your influencers are disclosing properly and in line with the way that you told them to do. You can always correct it, but if you have a repeat offender, you may need to terminate your relationship with them, just to be on the safe side.
And picking up on that topic of monitoring, because that's obviously a big part of ensuring compliance, and maybe opening up to the panel more broadly, You mentioned that you've done manual monitoring in the past, and that's a pretty tough way to make sure that everything's handled, particularly when posts can get deleted and things can get changed. Can the panel speak to what sort of automated processes for monitoring have you looked at, or what would your ideal solution be around this to make sure that you have that visibility?
We do both, right? So we use technology, either through third-party vendors, or we've developed, one of the 850 kids that I work with developed some SaaS product that can figure this out. And we also do manual hand-to-hand combat, right? And I think what you said before about keeping track of those that offend, the specific guidelines, when we used to work together and we had the addendum that said, you must say this. And those that didn't, specifically follow the directions, we never worked with them again. And so my leverage in that situation is my company and the brands I work with. And so that's how we kind of did it. And I think that's kind of the best way to do it, is kind of a combination of both with penalties. That's the key part.
Ryan, anything to add there?
Not in particular. I think that we've always requested the review when it's possible in the contracts of any creative before it goes out there in the world. Because the question of whether it's sponsored or not, or whether it comes across in that way, is not only within the caption, but also within the actual video creative or the image or whatever. But we fortunately haven't had any bad apples so far. But we do try to monitor it either by preventative measures, by making sure that we kind of review the stuff before it goes out there, or once it's in the world, making sure that we know exactly when it's being published, reviewing it quickly, and making sure that if it needs to be taken down, it can be taken down.
And in the world of influencers and even just sort of general posting around social media, you can also have people mentioning your brand who do not have a material connection in any sort of perhaps FTC-driven way, but are still out there representing as if they did. How do you stay on top of that? And can you talk to any experiences where that's come up?
It comes up more with us being this culturally relevant agency with, I would say, celebrities. And that's, back to the red light, yellow light, green light. Most of the time, that's kind of a red light for our brands. But that being said, if it's organic and you can insert yourself into a conversation in a way that's authentic, that the brand is happy about, then there are specific ways to do that. That is usually something that gets escalated to us. That's one of those freedom within a framework. If a celebrity mentions your brand, what should we do? Because that is all often developed on a case-by-case basis, right? How did they mention you? Was it organic? And so it's, again, I won't opine to specific guidance and all of that, but it really is case-by-case dependent. And you could do it, but that is one of those processes that gets elevated to one of my team members. She specifically handles that thing.
And I'll sort of related, but I'll chime in on something. We actually have a piece of our guidance that speaks to, so it may, not necessarily celebrity specific, but for example, you have customers that, might be commenting on your product and they like it. The question of the timing, to the extent there will be influence or a material connection later, does influence our evaluation of the claim itself. So if your customer organically says something great about your product and there was no inducement, they didn't say it because it was influenced by them getting something from you, then we wouldn't insist on a disclosure. But let's say after that fact, you reach out and you engage, and now that same customer or base of customers has reason to think that if they keep pumping out, good posts for you, that maybe there's some benefit to them. From that point forward, potentially messages do have to come with a disclosure.
Well, and that's a popular way that many influencers will try and get noticed by brands, is to hashtag or @mention them. So let's speak a little bit about, what the counter concern could be, which is, gosh, if my influencers, like maybe they legitimately think my brand is important and special, is it going to somehow make their audiences feel less enticed about my brand if they do have to put all these disclosures out? Like, firstly, have you discussed that in your organization? Do you think that's a real concern, as long as it is an authentic message or there? But can you talk a little bit about how, we're not undoing the upside by bringing transparency, and obviously we have to, but I feel like there's sort of a little bit of an interesting dynamic in there.
We have talked about that, and honestly, I think that if the content is great, consumers don't really care that it's sponsored. I mean, at this point, we're so used to seeing sponsored content out there anyway, and there are also very creative ways to disclose. I mean, honestly, you have to be transparent, but you know, I don't think that it actually takes away from the authenticity of that post if you're being compliant with the law.
I'd like to take that in a slightly different direction and talk about, you know, there are influencers, but pretty much like everyone kind of thinks they're an influencer now, whether they are or not. And you know, a lot of people, even if they have just regular everyday 9-to-5 jobs, like have an Instagram channel where they talk a lot about things that they review or things that they like. And actually this kind of question popped up with our employees, more so than our agents. Our agents have a lot of material telling them what, you know, thou shalt do and thou shalt not do. But what we realized was that there was a gap when it came to our employees. And we have about 10,000 employees. A lot of them feel very passionately about the company and also the work that we do. And we realized that we had to provide them guidance because they were getting themselves into scenarios where they were talking about how a product worked well for them, or about how life insurance in general is a good thing or not for a particular case or whatever. And we realized that they didn't have the proper guidance to protect themselves. They were kind of accidental influencers, not necessarily intending to be so.
But they certainly have a material connection.
Yeah, they were using social media to talk about stuff, and never about actual cases, but more about their own life. And I think we had to provide guidance to say that, you know, you can talk about how a product from our company has helped you, but you can't endorse it. You can't say, therefore, this is a solution for anyone who is a single mom or anyone who has got a mortgage in your house, you've got to get life insurance or whatever. You can talk about it anecdotally, but you cannot kind of make a recommendation. And that's where lines get a little blurry, and sometimes we do, in our monitoring, pick something up, kind of review it with our legal team, make sure that it still passes our tests. But that was something that we realized kind of belatedly was a level of guidance that really needed to be out there. Because we always thought about people we were, you know, had a relationship with to promote a product, or an influencer, or agents who are actually selling our product. And we forgot about our employees.
And I think that's something important to do for the influencers as well, is to have those sort of guardrails, because they will go out there and make claims about your product that may not be supported. So at that beginning relationship, you tell them, you know, these are the claims that we want. For instance, you might not want them saying any comparative claims versus a competitor. Make sure you say that up front. That goes for employees as well, but also for your influencers, that you need to really give them guardrails.
And I'll piggyback off of that also. To the extent that the claim being made by an endorser is sort of an objective claim that can be evaluated, it's the advertiser that is responsible for having the support for that claim. So I would advise against sort of cherry picking, like outlier results that are great, unless you have the backup that says that's the results that consumers generally can expect from using your product. If you do want to cherry pick, you're going to have to pair it with a message that says, you know, consumers generally experience X. So I don't know what's better for you as an advertiser, but just keep in mind that you are expected to have the support for objective claims being made on social media on your behalf.
Great. Well, I think that's just exactly what we have time for. Please join me in thanking this panel for sharing their experience.